All right, guys, so today we're going to talk about the birth of two different nations, England and France. And we'll even get into a little bit about the origin of the names of those places. England, the land of the Angles, one of the dominant people groups living there, and Franks was just called Francia once upon a time, the people of the Franks. So let's start with England. I love the history of England. I don't know why, it's just always fascinated me. Maybe that some of my ancestors come from there, maybe so much of our language comes from there and our culture and history. But England's story is fascinating. And if you look back through the 800s, kind of the Middle Ages in England, they were under constant invasion, particularly from a Norwegian people called the Danes. And Danish people invaded and conquered and established colonies and settled and lived and intermarried and are now part of the peoples of England. Now, before this, England had been invaded by a group called the Saxons. And perhaps one of the oldest people groups to live in England are the Angles or the Celts, and so hence the name England. But yeah, so England throughout its history has been invaded and parts of it conquered by different peoples. Yes, ma'am?
Are those groups still in England today, or are they basically gone?
No, absolutely. So Anglo-Saxon is the word that we usually use to describe white people, and that's a combination of these Angles and Saxons who had invaded and fought each other. But also many white people have Danish ancestry, because again, going back to this history of Danish invasion in England. But really, most people have a hodgepodge of tons of different ethnicities and races. But this is just kind of the story of these different people groups who came in. So, in the midst of these Danish invasions, there was a king of one of the most powerful small kingdoms within England. And his name was Alfred. And he managed to unite the Anglo-Saxons living in England to fight against and eventually defeat the Vikings and actually brought them together into one people. And so, sorry.
In the 9th century, an ominous new war machine emerged from the frozen north. Its low, dark shape crossed seas and penetrated silently through the narrowest inlet. For the people of Russia, England, Ireland, and France, this shape inspired fear. It was the Longship. The Vikings who came in these longships took their name from an Old Norse word for pirate. Molded by the subarctic climate of their native Scandinavia, the Vikings were skilled farmers, hunters, and fishermen. As warriors, they were known for their brutality. In Scandinavia, overpopulation created a constant battle for farmland. Short of space and surrounded by water, the Vikings were forced to seek new lands. They became master shipbuilders.
The distinctive feature of the Viking longship was its long, deep keel and very fine lines fore and aft, which meant that it could be sailed to windward. Instead of simply being pushed along by the wind, it could sail into the wind. Therefore, the Vikings could make progress whichever way the wind was blowing.
The longship also had a bank of oars so it could be rowed when the wind failed. It could be beached out of sight. It was the perfect vessel for seafaring raiders. With the longship, the Vikings could venture far across the ocean, even to the eastern shores of America. And where they landed, they took what they found.
The Scandinavians find no cause for grief in any man's death. Never have I seen a race that accepts death as the Northmen do.
To the early Christians in Europe, the Vikings were pagan demons. They attacked England for the first time in 793 AD, destroying the monastery at Lindisfarne. This was only a taste of what was to follow. In 840 AD, the longships brought a new threat: Viking warriors on horseback. The Viking attacks now spread far beyond the limits of the sea and river. An Arab trader who traveled with them described a Viking raid in Russia.
No words will say what blood was spilled, what screams filled the thick air, what horses and horsemen died in hideous agony.
The Viking advance was unstoppable. In the late 9th century, they raided England and Ireland, Iceland, Muslim Spain, and Sicily. While in the north, they drove deep into Russia. This was the height of the Viking expansion. But the Vikings would themselves be subdued by a power greater than any blade or axe. In 911 AD, the French king gave the Vikings a large area of northwest France. These Viking Norsemen in France became known as the Normans, and the land they settled as Normandy. Here, over time, they converted to the faith of the conquered, Christianity. But the Normans' greatest conquest was yet to come.
Now, England's history is a story of constant invasion. There were always people crossing into their island and claiming territories for themselves, up until 1066. This is the last time England was ever successfully invaded and conquered. It's one of my favorite stories, the Battle of Hastings. A man named William the Conqueror laid claim to the English throne after the previous king had died. In fact, there were 4 people that laid claim to the English throne. And probably the most native of these was a man named Harold. And he had already defeated 2 of the other rivals. And so Harold was temporarily ruling uncontested in England. And then William the Conqueror, a Norman, really of this same kind of Danish Viking ancestry, ruled a portion of what is today France, and he led a successful invasion, claiming his right to the crown of England. And this is the Battle of Hastings, and it's just an incredible story. And it's one that if you were looking for a group project related to something and you're not really sure what direction to go with yet, the Battle of Hastings is a fascinating one, because you have Harold representing this kind of old way, this Anglo-Saxon, this Danish style of warfare with the use of shield walls and a strong bodyguard called housecarls, and they positioned themselves on a hilltop around a shield wall, really like an old Roman strategy. And then William the Conqueror used some strategies that had never been seen before. For one, the use of heavy cavalry in war, which wasn't something native to English culture. And then that allowed for a tactic called the feigned retreat. He could attack a position and then pretend to run away, and then parts of Harold's line would break and chase him, and then he would turn on the enemy. But anyway, he managed to wear them down, and over the course of several days, eventually the Battle of Hastings was a victory for William the Conqueror. And
in the year 1066, a truly momentous event took place for the unified Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain, now known as England. For a force led by Duke William of Normandy invaded England and destroyed the army of King Harold at the Battle of Hastings. As a result, Duke William became the King of England, and so, with the raising of the Norman flag, a new chapter of English history began. For as King William dispensed vast areas of manor lands to his most loyal subjects, they in turn began to build magnificent stone fortress homes for themselves. And soon these Norman castles were sprouting up all across the English countryside. And with them came thousands of fantastic new Norman churches and monasteries. It was clear to all that a great change had come. The era of the Dark Ages, when the Anglo-Saxons had dominated England, was past. And a new, much grander era, called the High Middle Ages, was beginning to dawn, not only in England, but all across Europe as well.
this man became the last successful conqueror of England. But now, many English scholars refer to 1066 as the beginning of British history. And, for the first time, really now, all of Britain is united. And really every king's goal from that point forward is to keep England united and to not only control all of England, but even lands in France. Because William the Conqueror also controlled these lands in France, and so it was always a contest to see who could gain the most land in France. For example, Henry II managed to gain lands in France through marriage. Marriage was usually a political means to gain alliances, particularly in the royal family. So Henry was not only a king in England, but he had lordship over lands in France. But now the part in terms of getting to the seeds of democracy is that Henry II sent judges to various parts of France. He created a court system, and these judges would allow juries, and these jurors would come from the English people. And so this is the beginning of free, fair, and speedy trials by a jury of our peers. And so really England was one of the first countries to try this, and this is really an important piece in what's called common law. And that is that the rules that exist apply to everyone, not just poor people. Everyone, including even rulers. And so common law, that is the idea that laws apply equally and fairly, is one of these fundamental elements of democracy and became the basis for law in the English-speaking world, including we still practice common law here in the United States. So fast forward a few generations, and in 1215 there was commonly a power struggle between the executive and the legislature, between the king and the nobility. And really, today in the United States, there's a power struggle between the president and Congress, the king and the nobility. And there has been in governments throughout history. Well, it just so happens that in 1215, the king didn't want to obey the laws that the nobility were passing. And so the nobles gathered together and forced the king to sign a contract promising to obey their laws that were passed. And this was called the Magna Carta. And I believe part of the Magna Carta was one of your documents for your medieval Europe essay. The reason it's such a big deal is because it was the first time in English history, which England is so much of our philosophical and political ancestor. We get a lot of our ideas from them. Of course, they got a lot of their ideas back from Rome, back from Greece. You know, this is kind of why we've tracked it this way. But the Magna Carta represents a moment in history where even the most powerful people, kings, have to obey the same rules that everybody else does. And so it's a big deal. And the English people, this represented a moment where the English people insisted that everyone should have the same rights, equality for all. So these nobles eventually formed the basis for the first formal legislative body called Parliament. And Parliament, I guess the nobility organized into this legislature because of high taxes imposed by the next king. And so the nobility got together with the church and they formed a bicameral legislature, or parliament, or what we call it in the United States, Congress. They have two parts. There's the House of Lords, which is very much like the Senate in the United States, and then the House of Commons, which is very much like the House of Representatives in the United States.
In medieval England, in the year 1215, an important document called the Magna Carta was signed. The Magna Carta started an idea that eventually found its way into the American Constitution. That idea was the need to have a system of checks and balances on government power. Before the Magna Carta, or Great Charter, was signed, kings could simply do as they pleased without regard for anyone else's rights. But after the Magna Carta, kings had to obey feudal laws. They also had to share their power with the noble lords and be willing to discuss issues and work out solutions to problems with them. The Magna Carta soon led to the creation of England's Parliament, which is still one of the world's most successful institutions of government. In fact, the Congress of the United States was modeled after England's excellent parliamentary system.
Now over to France briefly. So, the beginning of French history, which really, Francia was once just a province of the Roman Empire, and then, of course, after the Roman Empire fell, they turned to feudalism, and various conquerors tried to unite the Franks. Clovis, perhaps, was the most successful during the Middle Ages. But really, the beginning of French nationalism starts with a person named Hugh Capet. And he was a duke from the central part of France who managed to unite the different provinces and regions within France and form a dynasty, a ruling family who governed over all of France. Now, the early Capetian rulers, that's the dynasty named after Hugh Capet, and these early rulers were really weak and constantly struggled with the nobility, just like these kings we were talking about in England, until we get to a king named Philip II. And not only did he expand French territory, but he managed to suppress the power of nobility, it really becoming more of an absolute ruler than any other king in France had been previous. So even though he's an absolute ruler, kind of like the kings in England, he established a court system, established a central agency to collect taxes, the beginnings of effective administrative government. So when we talk about the beginning of French history, Philip II here was responsible for adding the green lands, but then really all of this is now today France. So the grandson to Louis IX in this Capetian dynasty managed to strengthen the central government, managed to further unify and expand the territories of France. But during the reign of Philip IV, the monarch began to question the power of the Catholic Church over them. And Philip actually called a meeting of the nobility and the church, kind of like a State of the Union, so he could explain his policies and he could get support. But I think what's important here, since we're talking about the seeds of democracy, is that in this meeting to explain his policies, not only did he invite the wealthy and powerful, but he also invited representatives of the common people. And so this is very much like, if you are keeping up with the news, our president's about to give a State of the Union address either tonight or tomorrow.
What does that mean?
It's where he's going to be doing actually this, where he will be addressing the powerful and wealthy and representatives of all branches of government, but it will also be televised publicly for the world to see. And so our president every year does this. It's called a State of the Union address, where he'll certainly be talking about what's going on in Ukraine. He'll certainly be talking about inflation, and he'll lay out many of his goals and policies. One of the things he's been trying to do since he's been president is a program called Build Back America, and so he's going to explain more about that in his State of the Union address. And really, that precedent of an executive speaking directly to the people is established here. And so a tradition that you'll see tonight or tomorrow has been continued since Philip IV. Okay, so this meeting is not just a one-time thing. In fact, it's a meeting to form a legislative body that would cooperate with the executive being the king, to pass and implement policy. And this meeting is called the Estates General. And there would be three various representatives. There would be the first estate, that's the church. The second estate, this is the nobility, the wealthy. And then the third estate, and that's everyone else. And so, when you think of third estate or third world country, that's just another kind of euphemism for the poor. So this is really the beginnings of democracy. So, we talked about in England how a federal court system, we talked about with the Capetian dynasty, a central system to collect taxes. We talked about the Magna Carta, and now we're talking about branches of government in England and France. And so this is a common law, a court system involving people representing the poor in real decision making. That's just some of the basic elements of democracy that we got into.